The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sarah Lieberman carefully slid another photograph from its protective sleeve. Her fingers, covered in the thin cotton gloves all archivists at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum wore, moved with practiced precision. This was photograph number 137 from the Walsh Collection, a recent donation from the family of an American military photographer who had documented the liberation of concentration camps in 1945. Little Girl with Doll, Children's Ward, May 12, 1945, read the faded pencil notation on the back. Sarah typed the description into her database entry, her eyes lingering on the image. The girl couldn't have been more than 6 years old. She sat on a metal frame cot, her body swimming in an oversized dress, clutching a porcelain doll to her chest. Her hair had been roughly cut, probably to treat lice, and stuck out at odd angles around her thin face. She wasn't smiling, but there was something in her eyes, a desperate attempt to appear normal, perhaps for the camera. Sarah had seen thousands of photos like this one in her 15 years at the museum. Children who had survived against impossible odds, captured in those first bewildering days of freedom. Their images always affected her, but she had developed the necessary professional distance. Document, catalog, preserve. That was her job, to ensure that these fragments of history were properly maintained for future generations, not to get emotionally involved. The climate-controlled basement archive was quiet except for the soft clicking of Sarah's keyboard and the occasional hum of the high-resolution scanner. Most of her colleagues preferred the livelier atmosphere of the research library upstairs, but Sarah found peace in the archive's isolation. Down here, it was just her and the ghosts of history, a relationship she had carefully maintained within Sarah zoomed in to check the resolution, methodically examining different parts of the image, as she always did. The doll's painted face, the rough texture of the army blanket on the cot, the shadows under the girl's eyes speaking of traumas no child should endure. When she reached the girl's left forearm, partially visible where the dress had slipped down, Sarah's breath caught. There, faint but unmistakable against the pale skin, a tattoo, A7358. Sarah's finger froze above the keyboard. Children under 14 were rarely tattooed at Auschwitz. Most were sent directly to the gas chambers upon arrival. A child survivor with a tattoo was an extraordinary anomaly, a statistical impossibility that somehow became reality. She zoomed in further, increasing the contrast to make sure she wasn't mistaken. The numbers stood out now, blue-black against the child's skin. No one had noticed this detail before. Not the photographer, not the military catalogers, not the donor family, not even the museum's initial assessment team. For 79 years, this little girl's number had remained hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to truly see it. Sarah sat back in her chair, the quiet of the archive suddenly heavy around her. The professional distance she had cultivated for years seemed to waver. This wasn't just another artifact to catalog. This was a mystery, and potentially an important one. Children with tattoos represented an extraordinary breach in the Nazis' own terrible system. Who was this girl? Did she survive beyond that moment in the children's ward? What became of her after the photograph was taken? Sarah looked again at the child's eyes, staring back at her across time. For the first time in years, she felt the boundaries between archivist and subject begin to blur. This wasn't just professional curiosity anymore. She needed to know what happened to A7358. The museum's database hummed as Sarah typed in the search parameters, A7358. The Germans had kept meticulous records of their atrocities, a bureaucratic efficiency that now, ironically, helped identify their victims. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she pressed enter, something that hadn't happened since her first days as an archivist. The system returned a match within seconds. Transport records from late 1944 showed A7358 assigned to a female child, approximately 5 years old, from Moncach, Hungary. No name was recorded, just a transport number and a notation that made Sarah's blood run cold. Selection bypass, clerical error. The child had been mistakenly processed for labor instead of immediate execution. A clerical error had saved her life. By the time Sarah's colleagues began packing up for the day, she was still hunched over her computer, following digital breadcrumbs through the museum's vast archives. The photograph remained open on her second monitor, the girl's eyes seeming to watch Sarah's efforts with solemn intensity. "Heading out, Sarah?" Dr. Klein, her department head, paused by her desk, coat already on. "I found something unusual," Sarah replied, gesturing to the screen. "This child has a tattoo. Look at her arm." Dr. Klein leaned closer, squinting through his glasses. "Good God, you're right. That's extremely rare for a child that age." He straightened up, suddenly interested. "What have you found out?" "Transport records from Auschwitz." She was from Hungary. Ended up at Bergen-Belsen, where this photo was taken after liberation. Sarah hesitated. "I'd like to trace what happened to her, see if she survived beyond this photo." Dr. Klein studied her with the shrewd assessment of a longtime supervisor. "This isn't just curiosity, is it?" Sarah chose her words carefully. "It's historically significant. Children with tattoos are exceptionally rare. If we could identify her, trace her life story if she survived, submit a formal request tomorrow. 6 weeks, maximum, but you'll need to keep up with the digitization project too." Dr. Klein checked his watch. "Don't stay too late." After he left, Sarah sat alone in the dim archive, the only light coming from her computer screens. She should go home. She had dinner plans with friends, a normal evening ahead. Instead, she opened a new document and began outlining a research plan. Step 1 would be the Bergen-Belsen records. The British had documented the liberation extensively. If the girl had been processed through their medical system, there might be records. Step 2, displaced persons registries. Step 3, orphanage and adoption records. The museum had partnerships with archives throughout Europe and Israel. She could request document searches through official channels. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from her friend. "Still on for dinner?" She replied with an apologetic cancellation, claiming work deadlines. It wasn't entirely untrue. This felt urgent in a way she couldn't quite articulate. She opened her desk drawer and took out the photograph of her grandparents that she kept there. They had survived the Holocaust, but never spoke about their experiences. That silence had shaped Sarah's childhood and ultimately led her to this career, preserving the histories that so many survivors couldn't bear to voice. "I'll find out what happened to you," she whispered to the photograph of the little girl, making a promise to someone who might no longer be alive to hear it. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the museum 2 hours early. She bypassed her usual routine and headed straight to the record section, pulling files on Bergen-Belsen. The reference librarians raised eyebrows when she requested access to the Displaced Persons Registry and Red Cross repatriation records, but her reputation for meticulous work earned her the benefit of the doubt. By mid-morning, she had her first solid lead, a medical report noting a non-verbal Hungarian-speaking female child, age approximately 6, bearing tattoo, in possession of porcelain doll. The report was signed by a British nurse, E. Lancaster, dated May 10, 1945, just 2 days before the photograph was taken. In the margins, someone had handwritten, "Transport to Paris Children's Home approved. Escort, E. Klein." Sarah felt a rush of excitement that was anything but professional. This wasn't just a research subject anymore. This was a real child with a continuing story beyond the moment captured in the photograph. A child who had somehow survived Auschwitz with a number on her arm, who had been liberated at Bergen-Belsen, who was headed to Paris with a woman named E. Klein. The trail was warming up. Sarah pulled international displaced persons files, cross-referencing dates and transport lists. By lunchtime, she had compiled enough information to justify a formal research project proposal, which she submitted to Dr. Klein that afternoon. Subject: Research Proposal, Identification of Child Survivor with Auschwitz Tattoo. The approval from Dr. Klein came with conditions. Sarah could pursue her research for 6 weeks, provided she kept up with her regular duties. The dual workload meant long days and working through lunches, but Sarah barely noticed. Her usually tidy office transformed into a research hub, with maps tracking possible routes from Bergen-Belsen to Paris, timelines of children's homes established after liberation, and photocopies of relevant documents pinned to every surface. "You've gone full detective mode," remarked Miguel, a curator from the exhibitions department who stopped by her door. "Haven't seen you in the break room for days." Sarah looked up from a stack of transport manifests, blinking as if emerging from underwater. "I'm trying to track a child survivor's path through post-war Europe. The trail leads to Paris, but then gets complicated." Miguel leaned against the doorframe. "The Paris archives were a nightmare when I researched there last year. Half their post-war records were misfiled during a building renovation in the 80s. "Great," Sarah sighed. "Just what I needed to hear." "I've still got contacts there," Miguel offered. "I could put you in touch with Martine Dubois. She knows those archives better than anyone." That connection proved invaluable. Martine, a silver-haired archivist with 30 years' experience, responded to Sarah's email within hours. "The Children's Home's records are scattered across 3 different repositories," she wrote. "Send me all identifying details you have, and I will see what can be found." Sarah compiled everything: the tattoo number, the estimated age, the Hungarian origin, the doll, the escort's name, clean. 3 days later, Martine sent a scan that made Sarah gasp aloud in her silent office. It was an intake form from a Parisian orphanage called Maison de l'Espoir, House of Hope, established in late 1945. The form listed a Hungarian girl, approximately age 6, with camp tattoo, non-verbal but responsive to music and kindness, accompanied by doll, porcelain, girl in blue dress. The intake officer had recorded a name: Hannah Goldberg. For the first time, A7358 had a name. Sarah said it aloud, testing the sound of it. Hannah Goldberg. No longer just a number, a person with a name. With trembling fingers, she typed Hannah Goldberg into the museum's survivor database. No matches. She tried the Yad Vashem archives. Nothing. The girl had slipped through the cracks of official Holocaust documentation, remembered only in this obscure French orphanage record. The paper trail became slightly clearer after that. Anna remained at Maison de l'Espoir for 11 months before being legally adopted by Eva Klein, the same woman who had escorted her from Bergen-Belsen. Further research revealed Eva as a Polish survivor who had lost her own children during the war. Immigration records showed Eva and Hannah arriving in New York in 1947, settling in Brooklyn, among other survivors rebuilding their lives. Sarah tracked them through naturalization papers, school enrollment forms, change of address notices. In 1962, Hannah Goldberg married David Rosenberg. Their daughter, Sarah, a coincidence that gave the archivist goosebumps, was born in 1965. Hannah earned a teaching degree, worked at heart-pounding. Sarah loaded the VHS tape into the museum's archival media station and adjusted her headphones. The screen flickered, and there she was, Hannah Goldberg Rosenberg at 46 years old, her dark hair streaked with gray, sitting in what looked like a school classroom. "I became a teacher because I understand what it means to be voiceless," Hannah was saying, her English slightly accented. "When I came to America, I didn't speak the language. Before that, after liberation, I didn't speak at all for nearly a year. Trauma does that to children. So I've always had a special connection with children who struggle to express themselves." The interviewer, off camera, asked about her camp experience. Hannah's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "I was very young. Many of my memories are fragments. I remember the cold, the hunger, being separated from my mother." She paused. "And I remember my doll. Not from the camp, we had nothing there. She was given to me by a nurse after liberation." "Do you still have it?" the interviewer asked. Hannah smiled, the first real smile of the interview. "Yes. I kept her all these years. I named her Hope, after the children's home in Paris. She sits on my dresser still. Some nights, even now, I need to hold her to fall asleep." Sarah froze the frame, staring at Hannah's face. She'd found her, the little girl from the photograph, now a middle-aged teacher with gentle eyes and laugh lines. A7358 had become Hannah Goldberg, had become Mrs. Rosenberg, who taught first grade and still kept her doll. A quick search of current records confirmed what seemed almost too much to hope for. At 84 years old, Hannah Goldberg Rosenberg was still alive, residing in a retirement community in Boca Raton, Florida. Sarah sat back in her chair, the weight of her discovery settling over her. She had solved the mystery, followed the paper trail to its conclusion. Professional curiosity should be satisfied now. The museum would add Hannah's name to the photograph, update their records, perhaps even note the connection to the oral history interview. But it wasn't enough. Not anymore. Sarah found herself in Dr. Klein's office, nervously tapping her foot as she waited for him to finish reading her report. 5 weeks of dual workloads had left dark circles under her eyes, but the excitement of discovery had kept her going. "So you've positively identified the child in the photograph," Dr. Klein said, looking up from the papers. "And she's still alive." He removed his glasses, polishing them with a handkerchief. "Impressive work, Dr. Lieberman." "Thank you." Sarah hesitated. "I'd like to contact her." Dr. Klein's eyebrows rose, "But first, I need to establish contact, explain the significance of her story." Dr. Klein studied her face. "You've become quite invested in this case, Sarah." She couldn't deny it. "It's important, not just historically, but humanly." After a long moment, he nodded. "Draft a formal letter of introduction from the museum. Have legal review it. We'll proceed with caution. Many survivors are reluctant to revisit their experiences." The letter took 3 drafts to get right. How do you introduce yourself to someone as the person who discovered their childhood trauma documented in an archive? Sarah included a low-resolution copy of the photograph, explained its recent digitization and her subsequent research, and requested a brief conversation. She emphasized that Ms. Rosenberg was under no obligation, but that her story had significant historical importance. 2 days after mailing it, Sarah's office phone rang. "Hello?" The woman's voice had a slight accent. "This is Hannah Rosenberg. I received your letter about the photograph." Sarah's heart jumped. "Yes, Miss Rosenberg. Thank you for calling. I'm Dr. Sarah Lieberman from the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. You found me through my tattoo?" It wasn't a question. Yes, it was visible in the photograph when we digitized it at high resolution. "It led me to trace your journey from Bergen-Belsen to Paris, then to New York." A long pause followed. "No one has ever noticed that before. Not even me, in the copies I have." "You have copies of the photograph?" Sarah asked, surprised. "The Red Cross sent them to Eva, my adoptive mother, in the 50s, when they were trying to help survivors locate family members. We didn't find any of mine, but they sent the photograph. Eva explained it to me when I was older. There was a mistake that day. Someone put me in the wrong line." Sarah gripped the phone tighter. "Miss Rosenberg, would it be possible for me to meet with you? The museum would cover all expenses if you'd be willing to come to Washington, or I could travel to Florida." Another long silence. "You know, I've never given testimony. Eva did, and she always encouraged me to, but I wasn't ready. Maybe it's finally time." Her voice grew stronger. "Yes, Dr. Lieberman, you can come to Florida. I think I'd like to talk to you." 2 weeks later, Sarah found herself driving a rental car through a palm-lined entrance to Sunset Palms retirement community in Boca Raton. The contrast between the tropical setting and the somber purpose of her visit felt jarring. She parked, checked her appearance in the mirror, professional but approachable in a navy blazer and minimal makeup, and gathered her portfolio containing copies of all the records she had found, along with an official letter from the museum explaining the significance of their meeting. The lobby was bright with natural light, decorated in shades of coral and turquoise. At the reception desk, Sarah identified herself, trying to project professional confidence despite the butterflies in her stomach. This wasn't a standard research interview. This was something much more personal. "Ms. Rosenberg is expecting you," the receptionist said cheerfully. "Building C, apartment 214. The elevator is down that hallway." As Sarah walked the corridor, lined with residents' artwork, professional doubts crowded her mind. What right did she have to disrupt this woman's life with reminders of its darkest chapter? Was this research or intrusion? The questions had kept her awake during the flight to Florida. Yet when Hannah Goldberg Rosenberg opened her door, Sarah's doubts receded. The woman before her was small, but carried herself with dignity. Her white hair cut in a stylish bob, her eyes alert behind fashionable glasses. At 84, her face had the fine lines of a life fully lived, but something about her expression, a certain seriousness around the eyes, connected her to the solemn child in the photograph. "Dr. Lieberman," Hannah said, extending her hand. "Please, come in." The apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with books and family photographs. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked a garden where residents sat, enjoying the morning sun. And there, on a small table near the window, sat a porcelain doll in a faded blue dress. Hannah followed Sarah's gaze and smiled. "Yes, that's her. Hope has been with me a long time." Sarah felt a wave of emotion that had nothing to do with professional accomplishment. "Thank you for seeing me, Ms. Rosenberg." "Hannah, please." She gestured toward the couch. "And you're Sarah, yes? Like my daughter." She smiled. "Tell me how you found me, Sarah. Tell me what that photograph told you after all these years." They sat in Hannah's sunlit living room, two women connected by a photograph taken almost 8 decades earlier. Sarah began carefully, explaining her role as an archivist and how she had happened upon the image during routine digitization. "I've brought copies of everything I found," Sarah said, opening her portfolio. "Transport records, medical reports from Bergen-Belsen, intake forms from Maison de l'Espoir. Even your immigration papers from 1947. Hannah leaned forward to examine the documents, her fingers hovering over but not quite touching the papers, as if they might burn her. "It's strange to see your life reduced to forms and numbers," she said quietly. Sarah hesitated, then carefully removed the high-resolution copy of the original photograph. "This is what started it all. When I zoomed in on the digital scan, I noticed the tattoo on your arm." Hannah studied the image, her expression unreadable. "My hair," she murmured eventually. "They had just cut it because of the lice. I hated how it looked." Her finger hovered over the image of the doll. "And Hope. She was new then, a gift from a British nurse. I was so scared they would take her away." She looked up at Sarah, her composure momentarily cracking. Everything else had been taken. The simple statement made Sarah's throat tighten. All her professional training hadn't prepared her for this moment, the living reality of the history she had spent her career preserving. "Yes," Hannah said finally with absolute certainty. "That's me. That's Hannah." She rose from her seat and walked to the small table by the window, picking up the doll with a tenderness that made her hands look suddenly younger. She brought it back to the couch, placing it next to the photograph, as if reuniting the object with its own history. "She looks exactly the same," Sarah said, amazed by the doll's preservation. "I've been careful with her. She's been through enough." Hannah smiled slightly. "When I taught school, my students would sometimes notice her on my desk. I told them she was my oldest friend." "Would you mind telling me how you got her?" Sarah asked, switching on her small recorder with Hannah's permission. Hannah settled back on the couch, the doll now resting in her lap. "It was a few days after the British liberated Bergen-Belsen. I remember being very sick. Typhus. They told me later. There was a nurse, I never knew her name, who would sing to us children. English songs we didn't understand, but it didn't matter." Hannah's eyes took on a distant look. "One day she came with a box. There were 5 dolls inside, donations from somewhere. She gave them to the sickest children. I was one of them." "Did you name her Hope right away?" Sarah asked. Hannah shook her head. "No, not until Paris. At the camp, I didn't speak at all. Not a single word for almost a year after liberation. Her hand smoothed the doll's faded dress. Eva, the woman who later adopted me, she was the one who got me to talk again. She was from Poland, but she knew some Hungarian words. She would speak to me, little by little. She never pushed. How did you end up with Eva? The question wasn't on Sarah's planned interview list, but she found herself genuinely curious about the woman who had escorted Hannah from Bergen-Belsen. She worked with the Jewish relief organizations, Hannah explained. She had lost her husband and children in the camps. When she found me, she said, Hannah paused, swallowing hard. She said we were both alone in the world now, but maybe we didn't have to be alone anymore. Sarah felt tears threatening and blinked them back. This wasn't about her emotions. It was about recording Hannah's story accurately. But Hannah noticed. It's okay, she said gently. Eva taught me that tears are part of remembering too. They talked for 3 more hours, the recorder capturing Hannah's journey from traumatized, silent child to adapted immigrant to dedicated teacher. She spoke of Eva's patience, of learning English in Brooklyn, of meeting her husband David at a community dance, of deciding to become a teacher because she understood what it meant to struggle with words. I taught first grade for 30 years, Hannah said, pride evident in her voice. Children just starting to read, to find their voice on the page. She gestured toward a shelf of photographs, showing her with various classes over the decades. Some of my students still write to me, you know? They're grandparents themselves now. As afternoon light shifted to evening glow, Sarah reluctantly began gathering her materials. She had far more than she had hoped for. A confirmed identification, a first-person account of the child's journey, the still existing doll from the photograph. It was a researcher's dream. Yet, as she packed her recorder, she felt strangely reluctant to leave. The professional boundary she had maintained throughout her career had shifted during these hours in Hannah's living room. This wasn't just a subject, an identification number, a research project. This was a woman who had survived unimaginable trauma and built a life of meaning and purpose afterward. Would you, Hannah seemed suddenly hesitant, would you like to come back tomorrow? There's more to tell now that I've started remembering. Sarah looked up, surprised by the invitation and her own immediate desire to accept it. Yes, she said, professional plans instantly rearranging themselves in her mind. Yes, I'd like that very much. As she drove back to her hotel in the gathering dusk, Sarah realized that something fundamental had changed. She had come to Florida to confirm a historical identification, but she was staying to hear a story, not just for the museum's archives, but for herself. For the first time in her career, the line between professional and personal had blurred beyond recognition. And strangely, it felt right. When Sarah arrived the next day, Hannah was waiting with a cardboard box on the coffee table. It wasn't fancy, just an old shoebox tied with faded ribbon. But Hannah touched it with reverence. I couldn't sleep after you left, she explained, gesturing for Sarah to sit beside her on the couch. I kept thinking about things I haven't looked at in years. She untied the ribbon slowly, her fingers less steady than they had been yesterday. Eva taught me to keep everything. Paper is proof, she would say. In a world that wants to forget, paper remembers. Inside the box, meticulously organized, lay the documentation of a life rebuilt. Hannah's adoption papers signed by Eva Kleen in 1946, her immigration records to America, her high school diploma, her teaching certificates, photographs of her wedding to David, her daughter's birth certificate. But beneath these milestones of her reconstructed life lay darker artifacts. A small cloth bag containing a spoon she had kept from the camp, a handkerchief embroidered with Hungarian words, a handwritten list of names she had tried to remember after liberation, children she had known who didn't survive. Memory is heavy, Hannah said as Sarah carefully handled each item. Sometimes too heavy to carry alone. Sarah set down a yellowed newspaper clipping about Eva Kleen's death in 1983, suddenly conscious of the extraordinary trust being placed in her. Why are you showing me these things? She asked quietly. Hannah considered the question. Because you noticed what no one else did. That number on my arm. It's been visible in that photograph for almost 80 years, but you were the first person who really saw it. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing the faded blue digits that still marked her skin. A7358. I used to think it made me less human. Now, I know it makes me a witness. They spent the morning going through the box, Hannah explaining the significance of each item. The spoon had been given to her by another child in the barracks. The handkerchief was embroidered by Eva with a Hungarian lullaby when Hannah finally began speaking again. The list of names represented Hannah's first writing exercise in America, an attempt to honor those who had no graves. As they worked, the professional boundary Sarah had maintained throughout her career continued to blur. She found herself sharing stories of her own grandparents, their silence about their experiences, how their unspoken past had shaped her choice to work at the museum. They never talked about it, Sarah explained, not even with each other. I grew up knowing they had numbers on their arms, that they had lost everyone, but they never filled in the details. It was like living with a ghost that no one would acknowledge. Hannah listened with the attentive skill of a lifelong. Had she chosen this career as a way to answer the questions her grandparents would never address? Was her meticulous preservation of Holocaust records an attempt to fill the gaps in her own family history? Around noon, Hannah's daughter Rebecca arrived with lunch. In her early 60s, Rebecca had her mother's serious eyes but moved with brisk efficiency. She was clearly protective, watching Sarah carefully, as if assessing a potential threat. Mom says you found her in an old photograph, Rebecca said, as they ate sandwiches on Hannah's small balcony. Yes, during a digitization project. Sarah explained the research process that had led her to Hannah's door. Rebecca's expression softened slightly. She was up half the night going through old papers. I haven't seen her this animated in years. She lowered her voice. Just be careful with her. These memories, they're not just history for us. After lunch, Rebecca left for a doctor's appointment, and Hannah brought out a photo album she hadn't shown Sarah the previous day. This is my family, she said, opening to images of her husband, her daughter, her grandchildren. This is what I built after everything was taken. The photographs showed family gatherings, school events, vacations, ordinary moments made extraordinary by the journey that preceded them. And in several images, Sarah noticed the doll, Hope, sitting on a shelf or mantelpiece in the background, a silent witness to the new life Hannah had created. She was always there, Hannah confirmed, noticing where Sarah's gaze had landed. A reminder of what you survived? Sarah asked. Hannah shook her head. Of kindness, that nurse who gave her to me. I never knew her name. She didn't speak Hungarian, and I didn't speak at all, but she saw me, really saw me, when I was at my most invisible. She closed the album gently. That's what hope reminds me of, that even in the worst darkness, someone might still see you. The emotional weight of the conversation seemed to tire Hannah. She leaned back in her chair, suddenly looking her age. I think that's enough for today, she said. Coming back tomorrow? Sarah hesitated, aware of her professional obligations back in Washington. The exhibition planning committee would be meeting Monday. Dr. Klein had only approved a 3-day trip, but looking at Hannah's face, at the trust that had been extended to her, she couldn't bring herself to say no. Yes, she said, I'll be back tomorrow. That evening, in her hotel room, reviewing her notes, Sarah found herself overwhelmed by the responsibility she had taken on. Hannah's story was far more complex, more personally affecting than she had anticipated when she first noticed that tattoo in a digitized photograph. She had come seeking historical documentation, but had found herself drawn into the intimate details of a survivor's life. Not just the facts of what had happened, but the emotional weight Hannah had carried for 8 decades. For the first time since beginning her career, Sarah broke down completely, sobbing with a grief that seemed to come from somewhere beyond herself, a channel for voices long silenced. When the tears finally subsided, she sat at the hotel desk and began writing. Not the official report she would eventually submit to the museum, but a personal reflection on what it meant to truly bear witness. On the third day, Sarah arrived at Hannah's apartment to find her sitting with Hope in her lap, a determined expression on her face. "I've been thinking all night," Hannah said without preamble, "about your museum, about this photograph." She gestured to the copy Sarah had left with her. "You said it was historically significant because of the tattoo, because children my age weren't supposed to survive." "That's right," Sarah confirmed, settling into what had become her usual spot on the couch. "Your story represents an extraordinary exception to the Nazis' own terrible system." Hannah nodded slowly. "I want people to know about it, not just as a curiosity in your archives, but as an exhibition. People should see that photograph, understand what it means." Sarah felt a surge of professional excitement. This was beyond what she had hoped for. Hannah was essentially volunteering to share her story publicly. The museum would be honored. "We could create a special display around the photograph, incorporate your testimony." "And Hope," Hannah interrupted, "she should be part of it too." Sarah froze, the implications instantly clear. Hannah was offering to loan her doll, the precious object she had kept for nearly 8 decades, to the museum. The artifact would transform a compelling photograph into an extraordinary exhibition piece, connecting visitors directly to the child in the image. "Are you sure?" Sarah asked carefully. "Hope is very personal. The museum would take every precaution to protect her, of course." "But I'm 84 years old, Sarah," Hannah said with unexpected firmness. "I've carried these memories my whole life. Before I die, I need to put them down somewhere safe." She looked directly at Sarah, her eyes clear and determined. "Your museum is that place." Back in Washington the following week, Sarah presented her findings to the curatorial committee with uncharacteristic passion. The conference room was packed. Word had spread about her discovery, and staff from multiple departments had crowded in to hear her report. "The photograph of Hannah Goldberg represents an extraordinarily rare documentation of a child under 14 with a tattoo," she explained, displaying the high-resolution image on the projector screen. "But more than that, it allows us to trace the complete arc of a survivor's journey, from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen to Paris to New York to a 30-year teaching career in Brooklyn." She clicked to the next slide, showing a recent photograph of Hannah holding Hope. Most significantly, Hannah has preserved the exact doll seen in the 1945 photograph. She's agreed to loan it to the museum, along with providing additional video testimony about her life story. The committee's response exceeded Sarah's expectations. Dr. Klein suggested expanding the concept into a major temporary exhibition called Objects of Survival, featuring Hannah's story alongside those of other survivors and the items that sustained them. The museum director, impressed by the meticulous research and the living connection to a survivor, approved an expedited timeline and special funding allocation. "Dr. Lieberman, we'd like you to lead this project," the director announced. "Your connection with Miss Goldberg and your depth of research make you the natural choice as curator." Sarah blinked in surprise. Curator was several steps up from her position as archivist, a public-facing role with significantly more responsibility and visibility. "I'm honored," she said carefully, "but I'm not a curator by training." "Consider this a special appointment," Dr. Klein said. "You've already done the hardest part, building trust with the survivor and securing the artifact. The exhibition team will support you through the design process." By the time she returned to her office, Sarah's email was flooded with congratulations and meeting requests. The promotion came with increased visibility, a project team to manage, and a significant salary bump that would normally represent a career triumph. Yet as she scanned the messages, she felt a twinge of unease. This wasn't just another museum project. This was Hannah's life, Hannah's pain, Hannah's triumph over unimaginable odds. The responsibility felt enormous. Over the next 2 months, Sarah maintained daily phone contact with Hannah, who had agreed to record additional video testimony in Florida with a museum videographer. Their conversations ranged far beyond the practical details of the exhibition, becoming a cherished ritual for both women. Hannah's voice, with its slight Hungarian lilt, reminded Sarah why this work mattered beyond institutional prestige or career advancement. "You've given me back a piece of myself," Hannah told her during one late-night call, "a piece I thought was lost forever." The project attracted attention beyond the museum walls. A documentary filmmaker approached Sarah about featuring Hannah's story in an upcoming series. A publishing house expressed interest in a book combining Hannah's testimony with Sarah's research journey. University programs invited Sarah to speak about her methodology in uncovering previously overlooked historical details. The professional recognition was flattering, but Sarah found herself increasingly uncomfortable with her growing prominence in a story that wasn't hers to tell. During one particularly tone-deaf interview where a journalist repeatedly asked about how she discovered Hannah, as if the woman were an artifact rather than a person, Sarah abruptly ended the conversation. "Hannah Goldberg is not a discovery," she had said firmly. "She is a woman who survived against impossible odds and built a remarkable life afterward. I simply had the privilege of connecting her story to our historical records." 3 weeks before the exhibition opening, Sarah flew to Florida to finalize details with Hannah, bringing the specialized conservation case that would transport Hope to Washington. What should have been a triumphant moment, the culmination of months of work, instead became a crisis point. Hannah, holding the doll she had kept close for nearly 80 years, found herself unable to place it in the museum container. "She's all I had," Hannah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "When I couldn't speak, when I had no name, when I had nothing else, I had hope." Sarah sat beside her on the couch, exhibition timelines and museum protocols suddenly meaningless in the face of Hannah's raw pain. "You don't have to do this," she said gently. "The exhibition can proceed without the doll. Your testimony, the photographs, they're powerful enough." Hannah shook her head. "No, I want to do this. I need to do this. It's just—" She stroked the doll's porcelain face. "I need a little more time." Sarah called Dr. Klein that evening, explaining the situation. "We might not have the doll for the opening," she said, bracing for his disappointment. To her surprise, now she understood that behind every artifact, every document, every photograph in the museum's vast collection lay a human story as complex and painful as Hannah's. In this moment of genuine human connection, Sarah realized that her professional achievement had come at a price. She had asked a survivor to relive trauma and surrender a sacred object, all in service of historical documentation. The understanding fell on her with the weight of revelation. Sometimes, bearing witness means knowing when to step back, when to let silence speak louder than any exhibition ever could. The exhibition opening loomed just 2 weeks away when Sarah returned to Washington without the doll. She faced the curatorial team with the uncomfortable news: Hannah wasn't ready to part with Hope. The announcement sent ripples of consternation through the project team. Central display designs needed to be reconsidered. Promotional materials featuring the doll had to be pulled, and the narrative flow of the entire exhibition required restructuring. "We've built the centerpiece display around that artifact," the exhibition designer pointed out, gesturing to the blueprints spread across the conference table. "The empty cradle concept won't work without the actual doll." "I understand," Sarah replied, feeling the weight of their collective disappointment. "But we need to respect Miss Goldberg's decision. This isn't just any object we're talking about. It's something that helped her survive unimaginable trauma." While her colleagues maintained professional courtesy, Sarah sensed their frustration. After the meeting, Dr. Klein took her aside in the hallway. "You became too close to your subject, Sarah," he said gently. "This is why archivists maintain objective distance." The gentle reprimand stung precisely because it contained truth. Had she crossed a professional line? Had her personal connection to Hannah clouded her judgment? Compromised the exhibition? "I don't regret it," she told Dr. Klein. Getting to know Hannah as a person, not just a subject, it's changed how I see our entire collection. He studied her face. That may be, but it's created complications we now have to solve in very little time. Sarah threw herself into redesigning the exhibition, working around the clock to create something that honored Hannah's story without the physical presence of the doll. The team pivoted to a more expansive narrative, incorporating high-quality photographs of Hope alongside Hannah's recorded testimony about what the doll had meant to her. They expanded the sections on Hannah's teaching career and the generations of students she had influenced, the ripple effects of one survival story. The process forced a reckoning with her own motivations. Had she been driven by genuine historical purpose, or by the allure of discovery, of being the one to solve a mystery hidden for decades? Was she any better than the journalists who treated Hannah as a historical curiosity, rather than a living woman still carrying her trauma? The doubts affected her sleep, her appetite, her focus. She found herself staring at the photograph that had started it all, the little girl clutching her doll in the Bergen-Belsen children's ward, wondering if she had been right to pursue this story so aggressively. A week before the opening, additional complications arose when Hannah's daughter Rebecca called. Sarah was working late in her office, surrounded by exhibition text drafts, when her phone rang. "Mom's not doing well," Rebecca reported, her voice tight with worry. "Her doctor thinks all this revisiting the past has triggered something. She's disoriented, having panic attacks, not eating properly." The news hit Sarah like a physical blow. In her determination, Klein, who approved it without question, despite the exhibition's imminent opening. "Family comes first," he said simply, surprising Sarah with his immediate understanding that Hannah had become something like family to her. She booked the next flight to Florida, leaving her assistant curator with detailed instructions for the final exhibition preparations. The museum's carefully established professional boundaries, the ones that had defined Sarah's entire career, seemed to dissolve in the face of this human need. Sarah arrived at Hannah's retirement community to find her in the medical unit, diminished and fragile in a hospital bed. The strong, composed woman who had recounted her survival with dignity now seemed lost in time, occasionally speaking in Hungarian, calling for Eva. The attending physician explained that elderly survivors sometimes experience traumatic recurrence when memories are stirred up, the mind returning to its deepest wounds when defenses are lowered. "It's not your fault," the doctor assured her, noting Sarah's distress. "This happens sometimes when survivors engage with their past. The brain protects itself for decades, then suddenly the walls come down." Sarah sat beside Hannah's bed, holding her hand. All thoughts of museums and exhibitions and professional advancement evaporated in the face of human suffering. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though Hannah showed no sign of hearing her. "I asked too much of you." Hours passed as Sarah maintained her vigil. Museum colleagues called repeatedly. Decisions needed to be made. The director was asking questions. Media inquiries were piling up. But Sarah silenced her phone. The exhibition that had seemed so vital now felt hollow, a pale institutional echo of the living breath beside her. As evening approached, Hannah woke briefly from her sedation, her eyes clearing as they focused on Sarah. "You came back," she said with surprising lucidity. "Good. There's something I need to tell you." She gestured weakly toward her apartment. "In my closet, top shelf, a blue box." Rebecca retrieved it, an old hat box tied with faded ribbon. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper as fragile as memory itself, lay a second doll, identical to Hope, except for a crack running across its porcelain face. "The nurse gave two," Hannah whispered, her voice strengthening as she shared this long-held secret. "One for me, one for my friend Elise. She died 3 days later. I've kept both, all these years. Hope and memory." Sarah stared at the second doll, understanding dawning slowly. "You named them. Hope for me, memory for her." Hannah's eyes filled with tears. "I promised Elise I wouldn't forget her. that someone would know she existed. The revelation that Hannah had carried not just her own survival, but the memory of those lost, broke something open in Sarah. She wept openly, professional reserve abandoned, holding Hannah's frail hand between both of hers. "Your exhibition," Hannah continued, each word clearly an effort. "It should have both, hope and memory, together, like they've always been." Sarah found herself nodding, unable to speak through her tears. The price of truly understanding history, she realized, was becoming vulnerable to its pain. No glass case, no carefully worded text panel, no institutional framework could fully contain the raw human reality of what Hannah had experienced and what she had carried afterward. That night, Sarah called Dr. Klein from the hospital waiting room. She explained Hannah's condition and the discovery of the second doll. "We need to rethink the entire concept," she said. "This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about remembrance, about carrying forward the stories of those who didn't make it." Instead of resistance, she heard only thoughtful silence. Then, "Tell us what you need, Sarah. The exhibition can wait if necessary." She would complete it as something else entirely, a witness, a steward of living memory, forever changed by the human story behind a single photograph. Back in her hotel room that night, Sarah sat with the blue box open before her, the cracked doll, memory, resting on tissue paper beside her. Hannah had fallen into a more peaceful sleep, but the doctor's prognosis remained guarded. The trauma recurrence had weakened her considerably, and at 84, recovery would be slow. Sarah faced an impossible choice. The exhibition opened in 5 days. The team was frantically redesigning without hope Hannah's doll. Now here was memory, an identical doll with its own powerful symbolism. The memory of those who didn't survive, carried faithfully for decades by a woman who did. Using it would salvage the exhibition and possibly her career trajectory. But doing so without Hannah's explicit consent felt like the ultimate betrayal of trust. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with museum colleagues seeking decisions, but instead of answering, she called the one person who might understand the weight of what she was facing, her grandmother. "Bubby," she asked when the elderly woman answered, "did you ever feel like Americans turned your suffering into something educational?" The question opened a conversation unlike any they'd had before. Her grandmother spoke of feeling both validated and exploited by memorial efforts, of the complex emotions when private pain becomes public history. "After the war, people wanted to know what happened," her grandmother said, her voice strong despite her 92 years. "But they wanted it clean, organized. Museums put our lives in glass cases with nice explanations. Real memory is messier." "So you think these exhibitions are wrong?" Sarah asked. "No, Bubale, not wrong, just incomplete. Memory belongs to the survivors first." The conversation clarified Sarah's growing conviction that the current exhibition approach was fundamentally flawed, privileging artifact over humanity, sensationalism over dignity, institutional agenda over survivor agency. Sarah finally returned her colleagues' calls, requesting an emergency video conference with the full curatorial team and museum leadership. On screen from her Florida hotel room, still wearing yesterday's clothes, Sarah proposed a radical restructuring of the exhibition. "We need to postpone the opening," she began bluntly. "What I'm proposing isn't a minor adjustment. It's a fundamental reconceptualization of our approach." The faces on her screen registered shock, then concern. Instead of objects of survival centered on Hannah's doll and tattoo, I propose lives beyond numbers, focusing on how survivors like Hannah built meaningful lives after liberation. She took a deep breath. "We've been asking the wrong questions. We've been too focused on the trauma, not enough on the triumph of what came after." The proposal meant discarding months of work, rewriting text panels, redesigning spaces, revising promotional materials, all within an impossible time frame. "And the dolls?" Dr. Klein asked, his face unreadable on the screen. They'll be part of the story, but not the center, Sarah explained. Hannah has a second doll, one she kept for a friend who didn't survive. Together, they represent both survival and remembrance. But more importantly, they're still Hannah's. They stay with her until she decides otherwise. The ensuing debate was heated. Budget concerns, donor expectations, and institutional reputation all weighed against Sarah's proposal. Several colleagues openly questioned. The final decision rested with the museum director, who had listened silently throughout the discussion. When he finally spoke, his question cut to the heart of the matter. What would best serve the truth of this history, Dr. Lieberman? Not our institutional convenience, not your career, but the truth these survivors entrusted to us. In that moment, Sarah stepped fully into unfamiliar territory, not as an archivist preserving the past, but as an advocate shaping how that past would be remembered. The truth, she answered with newfound certainty, is that Hannah Goldberg is more than her tattoo. She's more than a photograph from 1945. Our responsibility isn't just to document what was taken from her, but what she built afterward. Her whole life deserves our witness, not just her suffering. A long silence followed, broken eventually by the director's simple response, "Make it happen." The news of the postponed opening created ripples throughout the museum community. Some colleagues avoided Sarah in the hallways when she returned to Washington. Others expressed quiet support. Dr. Klein, surprisingly, became her strongest advocate, helping secure the additional funding and time needed for the exhibition overhaul. "I was wrong about maintaining distance," he admitted during a late-night planning session. "Your connection with Hannah changed this exhibition for the better." Over the next 2 months, Sarah worked closely with Hannah, who gradually recovered her strength and clarity. They spoke daily, Hannah's insights guiding the new exhibition narrative. Instead of focusing primarily on her camp experience, they expanded the sections on her teaching career, her family, her community work with immigrant children in Brooklyn. The photograph that had started it all, the little girl with the doll, remained important, but it was now contextualized within the full arc of Hannah's remarkable life. The tattoo, A7358, was acknowledged not as the defining feature of Hannah's identity, but as something she had incorporated into a life of meaning and purpose. Most significantly, the exhibition now included the stories of 5 other survivors who, like Hannah, had built lives focused on education after liberation. This contextualizing move shifted Hannah's experience from isolated curiosity to part of a broader pattern of survivor resilience. 3 weeks into the redesign process, Sarah received an unexpected call from Hannah. "I've been thinking about hope," Hannah said, referring to her doll. "And about memory," she added, meaning the second, cracked doll she had kept for her friend. "I think they both belong in your exhibition, together, but not in a glass case." Hannah proposed coming to Washington herself for the opening, bringing both dolls to be photographed together, but remaining in her possession, visible but not separated from their keeper. "The museum isn't where they belong yet," Hannah explained. "Someday, when I'm gone, yes, but for now, they're still part of my living story." The suggestion represented a perfect resolution, honoring both historical significance and personal attachment. As Sarah relayed the proposal to her team, she realized how profoundly her approach to her work had transformed. She was no longer merely preserving artifacts or documenting history. She was facilitating an active dialogue between past and present, institution and individual, memory and meaning. The professional identity she had cultivated so carefully over decades had evolved into something more complex, but ultimately more fulfilling. A curator, not just of objects, but of living memory. The redesigned exhibition took shape with remarkable speed, driven by Sarah's clear vision and the museum staff's renewed commitment. What had begun as a narrowly focused display centered on a rare historical anomaly, a child with an Auschwitz tattoo, evolved into a multifaceted exploration of survivor resilience. Exhibition text that once would have emphasized the statistical improbability of Hannah's survival now highlighted the extraordinary life she built afterward. Sarah found herself growing into her new curatorial role, discovering talents she hadn't known she possessed. She had always been meticulous with historical details, but now she brought that same precision to the emotional resonance of the exhibition. Each photograph was chosen not just for its historical significance, but for its human impact. Each artifact was contextualized within the full life story of its owner. "We need to consider how visitors will feel moving through this space," she explained to the design team. "The traditional approach is to overwhelm with horror, then offer a glimmer of hope at the end. I'm suggesting we integrate both throughout, the darkness and the light, the loss and the rebuilding." The team responded to her leadership with increasing respect. Even colleagues who had initially questioned her objectivity came to appreciate the depth she was bringing to the project. The exhibition designer, who had been most vocal about the disruption caused by the postponement, became one of Sarah's strongest allies. "I've been designing Holocaust exhibitions for 15 years, he told her, one evening as they reviewed the final layout. "This is the first one that feels like it's about people, not just events." Hannah's health improved gradually, her recovery bolstered by her renewed sense of purpose. She recorded additional video testimony, focusing not just on her camp experiences, but on her life afterward, the challenges of adaptation, the support from her adoptive mother, Eva. Her decision to become a teacher, her determination to create a family despite the shadow of her past. "Every child I taught was a victory," Hannah said in one particularly moving segment that would become central to the exhibition. "The Nazis wanted to erase me, to make me just a number, but I helped hundreds of children learn to write their own names." That's how I answered. As the new opening date approached, Sarah traveled again to Florida, this time to accompany Hannah to Washington for the exhibition premiere. The flight was Hannah's first in over 20 years, and she clutched a small bag containing hope and memory, her 2 dolls, refusing to let them travel in checked luggage. "They've been with me this long," she said firmly, when airport security questioned the porcelain dolls in her carry-on. "They're not leaving my sight now." The museum had arranged for Hannah to stay in a hotel near the mall, with medical support on standby. Rebecca accompanied them, still protective, but now fully supportive of the exhibition. The night before the opening, Hannah asked to preview the exhibition space privately with Sarah. The darkened galleries were eerily quiet as the two women moved slowly through the installation. Hannah paused longest before an enlarged photograph of herself as a teacher, surrounded by smiling first graders in 1974. "This," she said, pressing her hand to her heart, "this is exactly right." When they reached the central installation, the original 1945 photograph alongside a newly commissioned portrait of Hannah at 84, tears came freely to both women. The portrait showed Hannah seated in a chair, holding both hope and memory in her lap, her left arm visible with its faded tattoo, her face dignified and strong. "You made me beautiful," Hannah whispered. "You were always beautiful," Sarah replied. "We just needed to see it properly." The opening reception drew museum donors, Holocaust education advocates, and media representatives. Sarah performed her role as lead curator with practiced skill, but with a new dimension of authority derived from genuine connection rather than merely institutional position. When she introduced Hannah to the gathered crowd, she did so not as a historical curiosity, but as a collaborator and teacher, whose wisdom had shaped the exhibition's approach. Hannah, initially hesitant to speak, found her voice as she looked out at an audience eager to learn from her experience. "I stand before you as a teacher still," she began, "and today's lesson is simple. We are more than the worst things that happen to us." She held up her left arm, showing the faded tattoo. "This number was meant to erase me. but I answered with a lifetime of helping children write their names." The applause that followed was spontaneous and heartfelt. In that moment, Sarah knew they had created something extraordinary, not just a historical exhibition, but a living dialogue between past and present, between institutional memory and personal testimony. The professional transformation that began with Hannah's story rippled throughout Sarah's career in the months that followed. The exhibition received national attention, praised for its innovative approach to presenting survivor experiences. Museum colleagues who had initially questioned her judgment now sought her input on their own projects. Dr. Klein created a permanent position for her, Director of Survivor Engagement and Ethical Representation. "We need someone who understands that our primary responsibility is to the people whose stories we tell, not just to historical accuracy," he explained when offering her the role. Sarah's personal transformation ran even deeper than her professional evolution. The careful emotional distance she once maintained, born partly from her grandparents' silence about their own Holocaust experiences, gave way to a more integrated approach to her work and life. She spoke more openly about her Jewish identity and how it informed her museum practice. She developed genuine friendships with several survivors whose stories she helped document, including Hannah, with whom she now spoke weekly. The boundaries hadn't disappeared entirely. Sarah remained a consummate professional, but they had become permeable, allowing for authentic human connection alongside scholarly rigor. Her grandmother, inspired by Sarah's work with Hannah, began sharing her own Holocaust experiences for the first time, healing a generations-old silence in their family. Hannah, now 85, experienced her own renaissance since the exhibition. The educational component she had insisted upon, focusing on how survivors rebuilt their lives after liberation, resonated particularly with young. She received letters from students inspired by her journey from traumatized child to dedicated teacher. With Sarah's encouragement, Hannah began writing her memoirs, documenting not just her Holocaust experience, but the full arc of her remarkable life. Hope and Memory, her two dolls, remained with her in Florida, but professional photographs of them appeared in textbooks alongside Hannah's story, reaching audiences far beyond the museum walls. The dolls had become symbols not just of survival, but of the dual responsibility carried by all who engage with Holocaust history, to honor both the living and the dead, to preserve both hope and memory. 6 months after the exhibition opening, Sarah sat in her new office, surrounded by photographs of Hannah and other survivors she had connected with through her work. On her desk sat a small ceramic replica of hope that Hannah had gifted her. It served as a daily reminder of the most profound lesson Sarah had learned, that behind every artifact, every document, every photograph in the museum's vast collection lay a human story as complex and rich as Hannah's. What had begun with a tattoo noticed in a digitized photograph had evolved into a fundamental reimagining of how museums preserve and present difficult history. Sarah had entered this journey as an archivist, concerned with proper documentation and preservation. She would continue it as something more, a witness, an advocate, a bridge between institutional memory and lived experience. "History isn't just about what happened to people," Hannah had told her once. "It's about what people did next." In embracing this principle, Sarah had transformed from keeper of the past to steward of how that past continues to shape our present and future, a change that honored both the archivist she had been and the witness she had become. 1 year after discovering the tattoo in that photograph, Sarah stood in the museum's East Wing gallery, making final adjustments before a special event. The Lives Beyond Numbers exhibition had been extended twice due to overwhelming public response, and tonight they were celebrating its anniversary with a private gathering of survivors, their families, and museum supporters. Sarah moved through the familiar space with new eyes, noticing how visitors lingered before certain photographs, which stories resonated most strongly, where conversations naturally sparked between strangers. The museum environment, the carefully controlled lighting, the precisely worded text panels, the security systems protecting precious artifacts, felt both comforting and somehow changed. Her assessment now included considerations beyond conventional curatorial concerns. Did this presentation respect the full humanity of those portrayed? Did this narrative honor both suffering and triumph? Had the institution made space for living voices alongside historical documentation? The exhibition had evolved over the year, incorporating new stories and perspectives. What began with Hannah's journey had expanded to include 15 survivor narratives, each highlighting not just survival, but the lives built afterward. Teachers, doctors, artists, parents, people who had refused to be defined solely by what had been done to them. Sarah had personally interviewed 12 of the survivors, applying the approach she had developed with Hannah, listening not just for historical details, but for the meaning survivors made of their experiences. Dr. Lieberman, a young security guard approached. "Your guests have arrived early." Sarah checked her watch, surprised to find it was already 5:30. Hannah had arrived in Washington the previous day, accompanied by her daughter Rebecca and granddaughter Leah. They had arranged to tour the gallery privately before the evening event. Sarah met them at the staff entrance, instantly noting the transformation in Hannah since that difficult time in Florida a year earlier. The older woman had regained her strength and composure, dressed elegantly in a deep blue suit that complemented her silver hair. She carried a small bag that Sarah knew contained hope and memory, her two dolls. "The flight was smooth," Hannah reported when Sarah embraced her. "And this one," she nudged her granddaughter playfully, "kept me entertained with stories about medical school." Leah, in her mid-20s, with Hannah's serious eyes and confident posture, smiled. "Grandma's been talking about this visit for weeks." "Before we go in," Hannah said, "I want you to meet my family properly. You've spoken with Rebecca on the phone, of course, but now in person?" She drew her daughter forward. "And this is Leah, my doctor-to-be." The introduction marked a significant boundary crossing. Sarah was no longer just a museum professional to Hannah, nor was Hannah merely a historical subject to Sarah. They had become part of each other's stories. The private tour began at the exhibition entrance, where visitors first encountered a large photograph of Hannah at 85, smiling directly at the camera, with a smaller inset of the original 1945 image that had started everything. The text panel beside it read, "History is made of individual lives. Behind every statistic, every historical event, are people who experienced, survived." When they reached the central installation, a meditation space where visitors could reflect on what they had seen, Hannah asked for a moment alone. Sarah, Rebecca, and Leah stepped back, watching as Hannah sat on a bench, opened her bag, and placed hope and memory side by side on her lap. Her lips moved in what might have been prayer or simply private conversation with the dolls that had witnessed so much of her life. She speaks to them sometimes. Hannah looked down at the dolls. "I'm 85 years old. I won't live forever. I want to know they'll be cared for, that they'll continue to tell our story when I can't." Sarah knelt before her. "Are you saying you want to donate them to the museum?" Hannah nodded. "With conditions. They must always be displayed together. They must never be separated, and they must be part of an educational exhibit, something that teaches young people not just about what we suffered, but about how we lived afterward." "I promise," Sarah said, emotion making her voice rough. "We'll honor those conditions." "Good." Hannah handed memory to Sarah first, the doll with the cracked face, kept for a friend who hadn't survived. "Elise was from my town. We were on the same transport. She was the one who told me my number when they tattooed me. I couldn't look at my arm, but she read it to me. A7358. Next, Hannah passed hope to Sarah. "And this one kept me company when I couldn't speak, when I was learning to be a person again after being treated like less than human." The weight of the dolls in her hands made Sarah acutely aware of the trust being placed in her, in the museum, In the future, these weren't just artifacts. They were extensions of Hannah herself, physical embodiments of both survival and remembrance. Rebecca put an arm around her mother, while Leah, the granddaughter born into freedom, stood witness to a history that flowed in her veins, though she had never experienced it directly. Sarah observed the 3 generations with professional pride mixed with personal affection, understanding that her work had facilitated a moment of familial reckoning and reconciliation. The evening reception drew museum donors, Holocaust education advocates, and media representatives. Sarah performed her role with practiced skill, but with a new dimension of authority derived from genuine connection rather than merely institutional position. When she introduced Hannah to the gathered crowd, she did so not as a historical curiosity, but as a collaborator and teacher whose wisdom had shaped the museum's approach. Hannah, initially hesitant to speak, found her voice as she looked out at an audience eager to learn from her experience. "I stand before you as a teacher still," she began, "and today's lesson is simple. We are more than the worst things that happen to us." She gestured toward the display case where hope and memory now sat together. "These dolls are more than toys. They are witnesses. They remind us that for every person who survived, many did not. Our responsibility is to carry both stories forward, the story of survival and the story of loss." After the public events concluded, Sarah walked alone through the museum's quiet galleries. She returned to her office, the same space where, a year earlier, she had first noticed the tattoo on a child's arm in an old photograph. The room looked different now. Gone were the rigid organizational systems and careful professional boundaries she once maintained. In their place, Sarah sat at her desk, opening a new file on her computer. The document wasn't an official museum catalog or research report, but something more personal. The beginning of a book that would explore how museums can better honor the living memories of survivors. As her fingers moved across the keyboard, Sarah recognized that she had returned to her familiar professional setting, but she herself had been irrevocably changed by the journey from archivist to advocate, from observer to participant in the ongoing work of memory. 2 years after the exhibition opening, Sarah stood before an audience of museum professionals at an international conference on Holocaust remembrance. No longer just an archivist speaking on technical matters of preservation, she now addressed fundamental questions of institutional ethics and survivor-centered approaches to historical documentation. "The objects we preserve are not separate from the people who own them," she explained, clicking to a slide showing hope and memory, Hannah's dolls, now permanently housed in the museum. "When we treat artifacts as mere historical evidence, we risk repeating the dehumanization that allowed the Holocaust to happen in the first place. Our responsibility is to preserve not just the physical object, but the human story it embodies." The large conference hall was filled to capacity. Lives Beyond Numbers, Beyond Identification had become one of the museum's most successful exhibitions, praised for its innovative approach to presenting survivor experiences through the dual lens of trauma and triumph. More significantly, it had sparked conversations throughout the museum community about how institutions can better serve as bridges between historical events and living memory, between artifact and meaning. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by a group of young museum professionals from across Europe and Israel. "How do you maintain objectivity when you become so personally involved with survivors?" one asked, echoing the concern Dr. Klein had raised 2 years earlier. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I've come to believe that perfect objectivity is neither possible nor desirable when dealing with human stories of this magnitude," she replied. "What matters is transparency about our perspectives and a commitment to accuracy within that framework. My connection with Hannah Goldberg didn't compromise my work, it deepened it." The professional transformation that began with Hannah's story had rippled throughout Sarah's career. She had been promoted to a newly created position, Director of Survivor Engagement and Ethical Representation, The role acknowledged that documentation alone was insufficient. How stories are told matters as much as the fact that they are preserved. Sarah had developed new protocols for working with survivors and their families, emphasizing collaboration rather than extraction, agency rather than objectification. Back in her hotel room that evening, Sarah video called Hannah, now 87, to report on the conference. Despite health challenges, Hannah remained sharp and engaged, eager to hear how her story continued to influence museum practice. "They're calling it the Goldberg Protocol now," Sarah told her with a smile. "Your insistence that we focus on your teaching career, not just your camp experience, has changed how we approach survivor stories." Hannah laughed softly. "And to think I almost didn't answer your letter." Their friendship had deepened over the years. Sarah visited Florida every few months, sometimes bringing her grandmother along. The two elderly survivors had formed their own bond, sharing memories and experiences they had rarely discussed before. Hannah had become a regular guest lecturer via video conference for Sarah's museum studies classes, offering future curators and archivists her perspective on ethical representation. Sarah's personal transformation ran even deeper than her professional evolution. The careful emotional distance she had once maintained, born partly from her grandparents' silence about their own Holocaust experiences, had given way to a more integrated approach to her work and life. She spoke more openly about her Jewish identity and how it informed her museum practice. The boundaries hadn't disappeared entirely. Sarah remained a consummate professional, but they had become permeable, allowing for authentic human connection alongside scholarly rigor. The most profound change, perhaps, lay in how Sarah understood the purpose of her work. What began as a mission to preserve historical accuracy, to ensure that artifacts were properly cataloged, that photographs were correctly identified, that records were meticulously maintained, had evolved into something both humbler and more ambitious. Sarah now saw herself as a steward, not just of objects or documents, but of human dignity. This new understanding guided her approach to an unexpected development. Other survivors, inspired by Hannah's story, began contacting the museum with their own artifacts and testimonies. An elderly man from Chicago sent the small metal cup he had kept since Dachau. A woman from Montreal donated the hand-drawn birthday card her mother had made for her in hiding. A family in Israel contributed the notebooks in which their grandfather, a doctor in the Warsaw Ghetto, had recorded medical treatments with scavenged supplies. Each donation came with a story that extended far beyond the camps. Tales of rebuilding, of creating families, of contributing to communities, of honoring those who hadn't survived by living fully. Sarah worked with each family personally, ensuring that their loved one's entire life story was preserved, not just their victimhood. The museum created a new permanent exhibition called Beyond Survival, drawing on these expanded narratives. At its entrance stood a quote from Hannah, "We are more than the worst things that happen to us." Visitors repeatedly cited it as the most meaningful aspect of their museum experience. Hannah's health began to decline the following winter. Sarah flew to Florida immediately when Rebecca called, spending long hours at Hannah's bedside in the hospital. They talked when Hannah had the strength, about everything and nothing. Hannah's granddaughter's medical school graduation, Sarah's new apartment, memories of Brooklyn in the 50s, plans for future museum projects that both knew Hannah wouldn't live to see. "I'm not afraid," Hannah told her during a lucid moment, her voice thin but determined. "I've had a good life. More than once, I wasn't supposed to have any life at all." She died peacefully 3 days later, with Rebecca and Leah at her side. Sarah had stepped out only briefly to get coffee, returning to find that final transition had occurred in her absence. Somehow it seemed fitting. Hannah had always maintained certain boundaries, certain private spaces even in their closest moments. The funeral was small but deeply felt. In her eulogy, Sarah spoke not as a museum professional, but as a friend, sharing how Hannah had transformed her understanding of history and humanity. She taught me that remembrance isn't just about preserving the past, Sarah said. It's about how we carry that past into the future, how we let it shape us without defining us completely. When Hannah's will was read, it contained a surprise. She had left Sarah a small silver pendant, engraved with the Hebrew word Zachor, remember. The accompanying note read simply, "Continue our work." 1 year after Hannah's death, Sarah stood in a newly renovated section of the museum, preparing for its dedication ceremony. The Hannah Goldberg Education Center would serve as a space where students could engage directly with survivor testimony, artifacts, and the complex legacies of the Holocaust. At its heart stood a special display case containing hope and memory, the two dolls that had witnessed one child's journey from Auschwitz to America, from number to name, from trauma to triumph. As visitors began to arrive for the ceremony, Sarah watched a group of middle school students gather around the dolls. Their teacher explained Hannah's story, not just her survival, but her 30 years of teaching, her family, her insistence on being remembered as more than a victim. "Why are there two dolls?" one student asked. "One for the girl who survived," the teacher explained. "One for her friend who didn't." Hannah carried both stories her whole life. Sarah had observed the children's faces as they absorbed this information, the dawning understanding that history isn't just about statistics and dates, but about individual lives with all their complexity. This was Hannah's legacy, she realized. Not just her own survival story, but her insistence that those who didn't survive must be remembered too. Not just the horror of what had happened, but the wonder of what came after. As Sarah stepped forward to welcome the guests, she felt the weight of the silver pendant against her chest. Zachor, remember, not just as an archivist preserves artifacts, but as one human carries the story of another, with care, with respect, with love. "Welcome to the Hannah Goldberg Education Center," he began. "I want to tell you about a remarkable woman who taught me that history isn't just about what happened to people. It's about what they did next. ...